It is incredibly hard to speak after a survivor has spoken and the beautiful music. Every time I hear survivor testimony, my heart breaks again. My hope is in the remarks that I've prepared today, talking about education, we can start to heal a little as we think about the future. Thank you, Mr. Numolo, for the introduction, and thank you to the Rwandan community of Midwest for this invitation to speak, to share work going on in Michigan to establish standards and teacher training in genocide education. I especially want to thank Mr. Albert Gasaki for his work to personally reach out to the Michigan Governor's Council on Genocide and Holocaust Education, and then for providing the details about this event today. Thank you also to Kalamazoo College, my college, and the Arcus Center for Social Justice Leadership. I am incredibly proud that my college continues to deepen its commitment to social justice, education, and leadership. And though your program lists me as a keynote speaker, with all due respect, I believe the keynote of any gathering like this to commemorate the genocide against the Tutsis are those words spoken by survivors. I want to thank Ms. Yergabitsa for sharing her testimony and her message, and to all the survivors. I may be a speaker here today, but the most important thing I will do today is listen. My journey to speaking here today actually began in 1997 when a new student showed up in my classroom in Gobles, Michigan, just 18 miles from this campus, but 7,620 miles from Kigali, Rwanda. Remy and his mother and siblings had recently arrived in the United States from Rwanda to join their father here. He had been doing graduate research at Western Michigan University and then had gotten a job out in Gobles. When I spoke to Remy on the day of his arrival, I discovered a bright, polite, but very reserved young man whose English was heavily accented with the music of African notes that I could not place at the time, but whose eyes held a story and memories far deeper than any 15-year-old should have to carry. I learned that day he was from Rwanda, and though I knew there had been a genocide there, I had read some newspaper accounts at the time. I didn't really know anything more. At the time I spoke to Remy and welcomed him to my classroom, I did not know who killed whom in Rwanda or why. I didn't know the difference between Tutsi and Hutu. I had never heard of a Twa. I did not know of the history of colonialism that stretched social hierarchy for more than a century there, or how in the 1930s, when the rest of the world was obsessed with race science, providing structure for the genocide in Europe that we now call the Holocaust, and justification here in the United States for forced sterilization against Black Americans, for discriminatory laws, for violence, and even lynching. I didn't know that racial identity was also forced upon Rwandans, and cards separating individuals by race established the structure that would eventually lead to genocide. No, I did not know those things as I spoke to Remy that day, or for most of the days that followed during the school year. Remy was a good student. He became very well liked, especially during soccer season. And he began to thrive. But in the spring of that year, in April or early May, Remy had a period of days where he became very quiet, when he checked out, uncharacteristically despondent, showing signs that he might be depressed. Concerned for him, I pulled him aside one day and I spoke to him privately, just the two of us. It was in that conversation that he finally mentioned the genocide of 1994, of hiding, of being separated from loved ones, of a country in chaos, of family members and friends lost, of memories no teenager should have to carry. I asked him if any of his classmates knew, and he just looked at me and said, "My friends know nothing about the genocide." And I remembered thinking, how could your classmates possibly know? Their teacher doesn't really even know anything either. So perhaps it is some kind of karma, or the long arc of my personal history, as Dr. Martin Luther King said, that bends towards justice, that 20 years after I was a teacher who knew almost nothing, I now chair the subcommittee in charge of training teachers on the Michigan Genocide and Holocaust Education Council, and I work as part of another committee preparing educational materials on genocide for Michigan classrooms. Our council was put together with the passage of Public Act 170, and it is my honor to serve with 14 other individuals from across our state, most of whom represent through scholarship or personal history a connection to the Jewish Holocaust or the Armenian Genocide. From our first meeting, we were charged by the chair of the committee, Lori Talsky-Zeckelman, to create education for Michigan classrooms that helps make our students more human, more responsible for one another, more prepared for the future with lessons of the past. It was and remains a beautiful vision, and it remains very close to my mind and heart as I work with my colleagues to carry out this charge. A beautiful vision, but a very, very tough task. Public Act 170 requires students spend 6 hours learning about genocide while in their secondary schools here. And during those 6 hours, the law mandates students learn about both the Armenian Genocide and the Holocaust, as well as lessons about genocide as a concept in and of itself. Those two historic examples of genocide are required content, but beyond that, the law does not specify how we teach or what content we cover. 6 hours is not enough, not by a long shot. For students in places like Gobles, Michigan, who are taught a U.S.-centered history, even a U.S.-centered world history, one that largely skims topics of study and mostly ignores world geography and cultural studies. I am pleased to say the state of Michigan has worked to address problems in curricular design and history with the release of new standards that emphasize inquiry and historiography and a deeper commitment to geography and cultural studies. That said, the challenge of too little time persists. So we only have 6 hours for this content and a sequence of classes that touches briefly on a list of topics and dates and names that students far too often experience as the dusty shelves of history, rather than as an ongoing story in which they too have a part. But on the Governor's Council, we have chosen to look at the opportunity those 6 hours provide, rather than the fact it's not enough. We decided to believe that if we used those 6 hours well, we could light a fire of inquiry and provide mental model for our students that would make them lifelong students of genocide. And more importantly than that, young adults who recognize history provides us with so many examples of times when human beings failed one another, and that our future can be and must be different. Again, a beautiful vision, but a very, very tough task. In my work as a Holocaust and genocide educator, the connections have made all the difference. In 2012, I stood outside the gates of Auschwitz in Poland, that infamous place in Holocaust history, and the site of perhaps the largest mass grave in human history. I was there with a group of 25 or so other Holocaust and genocide educators from across the United States, including a man I did not know very well yet, a professor from Alabama named Gatsinzi Basanyetsi. As we waited for the gates to open to begin our tour, Gatsinzi and I chatted a little bit, the polite chatter of people who are mostly strangers to one another. Gatsinzi asked me about where I was from, and I told him I lived in Michigan, in a town near Kalamazoo, but I was from a smaller town in Michigan called Niles. Niles, Gatsinzi said. I know Niles. I've been there to the train station. I was dumbfounded. So much so that I wrote about it later that night in a poem about my day. This is just a small part of a larger poem. I look around Auschwitz and see that it could be Michigan, with its birch trees and pine copses. The neat red brick buildings could be my comfortable college, the lovely homes like the ones on my street. Juxtaposition, put anything together with any other thing, and it will mean something even if that thing can't be understood. If Gatsinzi could tell me he knows where I'm from, if a Rwandan from Alabama could tell me in Poland that he'd been to the train station in Niles, Michigan, where I grew up, hearing train whistles, then you'll please excuse me, there is nothing outside history. And there is nothing that is not both sacred and profane. This train station at Auschwitz could also be mine. Connections can make the world small in ways that shake you to the core. Gatsinzi and I remain connected through the network of educators with whom we traveled, and through him I have learned a great deal about the connections between 1994 in Rwanda and 1944 in Germany. Through his scholarship and leadership, I have learned about great forces at work to sanitize and marginalize the true history of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsis, both inside and outside Rwanda, to silence voices of outrage that demand justice in an exchange for reconciliation and forgiveness. The trouble with movies like Hotel Rwanda that embellish the truth, to make a movie that meets the expectations of Hollywood and popular culture, that always demands a hero and a happy ending. Gatsinzi asked me, and I asked students, to remain skeptical about answers to complex questions that are too simple on the face of it. He taught me to question whether symbols of justice are more important than true justice, like judgments in many of the court proceedings that have taken place to hold killers accountable inside Rwanda or in international courts. And in fact, as I was preparing for today, speaking with Mr. Gasaki about the events, he told me he was related to Gatsinzi through his wife, and all I could do was smile. I was relieved to learn that Gatsinzi had told Mr. Gasaki that he knew me and that I was a good guy, at least as far as he could tell. Connections. They can also make the world smaller in ways that is so comforting. The genocide curriculum our Governor's Council is preparing to share for the first time in the coming weeks stresses connections because it asks students to learn a framework for genocide studies using the work of Gregory Stanton on the stages of genocide. Students will learn about a pattern that includes dehumanization, classification, and the rest, all the way up to preparation and extermination. Students will be asked to see how these patterns that took place in our two mandated genocides, the Holocaust, the Armenian genocide, repeat. And they also took place in Rwanda in 1994, and in Cambodia in the 1970s, in Ukraine in the 1930s, and in Bosnia in the early 1990s. Again, as the speaker said earlier, too many places to name. But I want you to know that our recommended curriculum in Michigan will include material on the genocide against the Tutsis. I also want you to know that when I leave here, I will never forget the lighting of the candles and the holding of that flame. I will hold it as I think about the work that I'm doing. In the years that I've been doing this work, growing as a scholar on the Holocaust and other genocides, performing, publishing my own research, working across Michigan, I have been moved most by those times I've been able to work with and learn from survivors. As an educator, I believe the formative center of genocide education is survivor testimony. I believe that something powerful happens and can only happen when students have survivors as their teachers. When one human being, a student, listens to another human being, a survivor, share his or her story, then the connections that humans make with one another that transcend content are shared. A student may someday forget the name of a small town in Poland or the name of the Chibongo province, but that student will never forget the look in the survivor's eyes or the way the survivor trembled as he or she remembered and shared what happened. I've learned that there is a rupture in every survivor's story, a rupture of family, of home, of community, of the world. Sometimes it's a rupture of faith or of hope. It's always a rupture of what it means to be human. For those reasons, it is especially important for students to hear from survivors whose story is told by a person and happens in a place so very different from what they know. Gobles, Michigan is 7,600 miles from Rwanda, and Gobles is 98% white. But when a survivor talks of his or her family, of love and of loss, of brothers, sisters, of children, of grandparents, there is no longer any space between those two people sharing a story about what it means to love and to lose. Connections matter, especially across what seems like differences at first. Because I think survivor testimony is so important, I am grateful to have worked with the USC Shoah Foundation since 2011 as a master teacher, helping to develop and share survivor testimony for classroom use. The collection at the USC Shoah Foundation includes testimony from survivors of the Armenian genocide that took place more than 100 years ago, Though there are no longer any known survivors who remember the Armenian genocide firsthand, the testimony exists in perpetuity for classroom use and for research. The archive also includes testimonies from the genocide against the Tutsis, perhaps even testimonies from some of you in this room. Those resources will be available 100 and 1,000 years from now, when stories will live with the same vibrancy and the same urgency as the day they were shared. In 2012, I was in Los Angeles working with the foundation, and I had the chance to work, as was mentioned, with a small group of educators from the Aegis Trust Kigali Genocide Memorial, including Freddie Mutenguha. I worked a little with Freddie and his crew to look at and think about how survivor testimony is key to genocide education at the memorial. It was an honor to meet him and to learn of the work going on in Rwanda at the memorial. On Freddie's team was Jean Nipo Indahimana, a quiet, intense, deeply committed educator. As I worked with Nipo, I wondered a little why he seemed so unsettled by the work. Los Angeles can be a beautiful place, and we had the amazing resources of the foundation there. But it was on our last day of work, at our closing luncheon, that Nipo stood up and told the 100 of us there or so that it was hard for him to come to Los Angeles because back in Rwanda, his wife was expecting their first child, who was due any day. He had shared that he had to decide between coming to America to do this important work, even though it meant risking missing the arrival of his first child, or he could choose to remain in Rwanda to be sure not to miss the birth, but miss doing the important work of the Aegis Trust. He had come to do the work, he decided finally, hoping the child would wait for his return to Rwanda to arrive in the world. And that explained why Nipo was so unsettled. But it was what he said next I will never forget. He then told us that during the 1994 genocide against the Tutsis, his family had all been almost completely killed in the violence. But now he said, with a shaking voice, that with the arrival of this child, he knew that his bloodline, the line of his family, would go on, and after so much death that his family had experienced, here, now, life again, like a phoenix from the ashes, he said, would go on. In Holocaust studies, we often talk about the Jewish concept of tikkun olam, of repairing our world. One Holocaust survivor I worked with said that when he walked out of the concentration camp at Buchenwald, he knew he had to immediately start loving and living again, because otherwise the Nazis would win, and the Nazis were not going to get another minute of his life. For Nipo, his tikkun olam was the creation of his work with Aegis Trust at the memorial, and the creation of a child, his child, to be born again into hope and the love of a father. I confess that there are days when I wonder if education like the work of the Governor's Council can truly make a difference when it comes to genocide, and then I tell myself, it's probably the best answer we have. And then, sometimes, I'm lucky to remember Angel, and I know for sure. Angel was a senior in my class long after Remy graduated from high school. Angel listened carefully to the lessons about genocide during our unit, and as far as I could tell, he took them to heart. And then he too graduated and went on to Michigan State. The year after his graduation, I was teaching a lesson, and all of a sudden there was a persistent knocking on my classroom door. It was Angel. And he had to tell me a story, and it couldn't wait. So I invited him into my classroom. Angel told me and all of the students there that the other day he had been walking on campus, just out of his dorm room, and he came upon a large group of students antagonizing a couple of other students. It was clearly escalating to become something ugly and possibly violent. And then Angel said the next thing he knew, he was standing in the middle of both groups of students, breaking it up and sending the large group of students on its way. He said the only thought he had was, don't be a bystander, don't be a bystander, don't be a bystander. So he took action, and the situation came to its end. Angel said it was our unit on Holocaust and genocide that put those words in his head, and he just wanted me to know that. Keep teaching this, he said, as he walked back out my classroom door. And then 3 years later, in 2016, Angel made national news when a group of students at Michigan State was mocking students of color on Halloween through disparaging costumes and comments. Angel was that MSU student leader who took on this group and even spoke to the MSU Board of Trustees about problems with discrimination on campus. And now it's my turn to say, Angel, you keep teaching this too. Education works. It's the best solution we have. And in that spirit, I would like to conclude with one more brief story, this one from my own undergraduate career here at Kalamazoo College. In 1990, I traveled to Madrid, Spain to study and live for a while as an international student. It is perhaps the most important formative experience of my life. I remain grateful to Kalamazoo College and my parents for encouraging and supporting it. One day, many weeks into my time in Spain, I found myself incredibly homesick. I missed my mom, my girlfriend, the dog, basically everything that was familiar. So I wandered into a cafe a few blocks from my home to have a Coke, to sit a little by myself and to think. As I sat there, feeling homesick and sorry for myself, all of a sudden I felt a tug on my sleeve. A little wrinkled old man, he had to be in his 80s, maybe even more, had come up to me and wanted my attention. "¿Quién eres?" he asked. "Who are you?" "Una estrella de basketball?" "Are you a basketball star?" he asked. I told him I was an exchange student who had come to study Spain, its culture, its language, its people. "You have come to study us," he said. And he smiled. And then he sat down next to me and said something that stuck with me. "Somos hermanos," he said. "We are brothers." And in Spanish, it sounds so much more poetic. "Somos hermanos porque somos humanos." We are brothers because we are human. All of a sudden, I was no longer homesick. Education works. It gives you opportunities to see the other and meet that person and know that you are the same. It makes the world smaller through its connections. I don't know if the curriculum we're putting together or the work of the Governor's Council will get us to the experience of brotherhood and sisterhood across Michigan, but I hope. I hope through our materials and teacher training, more teachers will know what happens around the world, so that when a student like Remy shows up in a classroom, and increasingly we're seeing students show up who are refugees in our classrooms across Michigan and across the country, that our teachers will be better able and better prepared to support those students. I do want you to know that I ran into Remy's father last year. Remy's doing well. The entire family is doing well. He's now in his 30s and still living in the area, and I understand he's still pretty good at soccer. I can tell you for sure that if our education can create more students like Angel who actively stand up for others, it will be incredibly valuable to our state and of our world and to our future. A future far better than the past we are responsible to remember and to honor like we do here today. I am incredibly grateful and humbled for this opportunity to share our work with you, to attach my story a little bit to yours in the spirit of Tikkun Olam and repairing our world. And it's my honor to be here to help remember lives lost in 1994 in the genocide against the Tutsis. Thank you for your work and for remembering and for helping us think about a future that can look so much different than our past.